So this episode is dedicated to glitches in the metabolic loop. We've talked about the metabolic loop for a number of times on this podcast, but Andrea has kind of a catchy slogan when it comes to this topic.
Because there are glitches in the metabolic loop, and glitches are bitches. We can say that, right? Bitches?
I think we can.
All right.
This is
I
a
think
podcast.
it's all right. I think bitches has been normal.
It has. But what does that actually mean in your mind?
My metabolism, as well as yours, Mark, got a lot of glitches.
It had glitches. It did, yeah. Mine did too, yeah. You can tell from this conversation that Andrea and I have not gone to medical school.
We went to the unglitcher, Dr. Emily Cooper. That's her unofficial title, the unglitcher.
Oh my gosh. This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see you both.
Hello.
I've been dying to say this. This just in. Fake news about fat. And we're not really lying. We've leaned on Andrea and her decades-long career in marketing at the network level to create a title that would bring you into our tent and help you understand glitches in the metabolic loop. Because as Andrea says...
glitches are bitches.
So you can tell that, Dr. Cooper, we're going to get straight into this with straight talk on this. This is really, to get more serious, this is about the signals that take place in this very intricate feedback loop called our metabolism. On the face of it, Dr. Cooper, what is our metabolic loop?
Well, that loop with our metabolism, it's so important because it relays signals from our body to our brain and our brain back to our body that help kind of regulate our metabolic system, both our appetite, our energy expenditure, our insulin levels. And sometimes that input that's coming in is accurate input and it's perceived accurately and the proper thing in response is done by the brain to help that regulation process make sense. But then sometimes there are inaccurate signals that are coming in or imperception of the signals by the brain, and that's what creates this potential fake news situation.
I think this is such an interesting idea, Dr. Cooper, because there's actually a startup company in Seattle called Tiny Pulse, and what they do is they gather intelligence at the lowest level in organizations and then process that information and transmit it to the very top levels of that organization. They actually have as a client a convent in Europe. They have major corporations. But the underlying idea is that to run any organization well, if the top managers don't fully understand what's going on at the very lowest levels in the trenches, it's going to get off track and you're going to make bad decisions and it's going to be bad for everyone in the organization. And I think this idea that our brain is the CEO, and if our brain is getting bad information about our metabolisms, we really are sunk. And Andrea and I are both living messed up living examples of our metabolisms had glitches that were lying to our brain, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And I mean, it's true. That's why the metabolic system, you can apply logic to it, and you can actually predict quite a bit by just applying that logic that you just laid out. And because most people are not aware that the brain is really the CEO of our metabolism, it's in charge. And it's what happens in our brain pathway is responsible for the majority of what happens with our weight, our appetite, the insulin levels, and some other metabolic processes, our energy expenditure. So without realizing, well, how does our brain decide to do anything about that? How does our brain know? Well, it's relying on input signals throughout our body. And those input signals come from our blood levels of different nutrients, our body fat hormones and messengers that the body fat is signaling out, and our gut hormones that are informing our brain about our nutrition status. So all of those input signals collectively form what's called the peripheral metabolic pathway. And that pathway is what is responsible for sending the signals initially to the brain so that the brain can receive those signals, interpret those signals, and then send back a signal to the body that represents the totality of what it has received, the information it's received, and the directions for what should happen.
So let's break down these inputs a little deeper, Dr. Cooper. Let's start with the signals that begin in the gut. And we've talked about GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and Mounjaro, which are the body's, it's mimicking the body's natural hormones that are created in our stomachs. Those hormones go into our bloodstream up to our brain, and our brain reads that information, right?
Yes, it also transmits it through the vagus nerve, which is like a nerve pathway. And so there's a lot of ways that the brain receives that input signal. But it's true, those hormones are called incretins, and they are throughout our gut and sending that signal up that really is trying to inform the brain about what our nutritional status is, how nourished we are. And there's other signals, though, that are coming up to the brain that are saying that too, like the circulating levels of insulin. That's a hormone the pancreas produces. There's another hormone called amylin that the pancreas produces, and glucagon that the pancreas produces. So there's all of these signals, not just from our GI tract, but from other places in our body that are informing the brain of whether we have adequate fuel or we don't have adequate fuel.
But sometimes the hormones are like a bad Russian novel, like Dostoevsky or something, and the relationships don't go as planned, or somebody's having a fight, or somebody's lying to each other, and it doesn't go well. That's, I think, what happened to mine.
Well, it can happen. And, most of the glitches, so to speak, are due to genetic predisposition. Most of it is that. Yeah. It's like, it's really responsible for creating that vulnerability is the genetics, because then our genetics mixes with our environment, and throughout that process, these glitches could occur because there could be vulnerability. And so it makes us more sensitive if you're genetically vulnerable to things like endocrine disruptors or effects of certain medications or effects of inadequate fueling. So or effects of not getting enough sleep, stress, all these things that will affect you more if you have the genetics and potentially trigger some of these glitches that we talk about. So, for example, if you think about a situation where the brain is receiving very positive signals, very reassuring signals, maybe it would be receiving adequate amounts of these GLP-1 signals from the gut, adequate amounts of amylin and insulin from the pancreas, not too much, not too little, and not having excessive amounts of glucagon from the pancreas, because that would say, wait, glucagon triggers when we're fasting. So we don't want it to be too high because it would say maybe we don't have enough fuel. So if it has adequate amounts of those hormones, and then if the body fat is releasing the amount of leptin that reflects a normal body weight, and another hormone called adiponectin that also comes from the body fat, that is beneficial because it improves our energy metabolism. And if the nutrients in our bloodstream are good, our glucose levels are good, we have adequate nutrition, if all of those input signals are looking positive, saying we're well fed, we weigh enough, then the brain, if it's able to interpret that correctly, says, oh, this is really reassuring. So that means that I will then go through my sequence of steps to produce a reassuring signal that is going to go back to the body to say, the overall picture is green light, metabolism's fine, we're not at risk of famine. And so that would be like the optimal situation. But if there are glitches, something can happen that throws off some of those input signals. So where maybe the leptin is now suppressed, that hormone from the body fat. And now it's saying, wait, there's not enough body fat. There's not enough weight on this person. And that can happen from just like dieting or not sleeping well enough or sleep apnea. So that could start creating a glitch in the system. And again, people with genetics for obesity or diabetes are much more at risk for something like that actually leading to problems where the brain then looks at that and kind of freaks out and says, whoa, we've got to slow the metabolism down, jack up the appetite. We've got to really facilitate more body fat accumulation somehow because we're at a state where there's not adequate body fat. So that whole process can occur. And another important input signal would be from the stomach, and that one is called ghrelin. And ghrelin, the interesting thing is most of the input signals are positive signals that are reassuring when they're at adequate levels. There's a couple of exceptions, and only a couple of exceptions to that. One would be if your blood sugar is too low, that becomes a negative signal saying, hey, we're starving. Or if your ghrelin, which is a hormone from the stomach, is elevated, that's also a negative. So the only other negatives there would be is if the positive signals become weakened. So everything's pretty positive unless it becomes weakened, then it turns to a negative. And there's only a couple of true negative signals that are in there. But all of these alter with our lifestyle. So diets cause the ghrelin, the negative signal that says the body's too hungry, it causes it to go up. And the leptin, the reassuring signal, causes it to go down. So obviously that's sending in a signal that says we don't have enough food and we don't weigh enough. Now that could be that the scale is saying that your weight is really high, but your brain is thinking that your weight is actually too low. So this is where these incoming signals, if they get caught up in some problem, then that's creating a glitch that then will cause your brain to react to that in a negative way. And so the perception of starvation becomes as strong as actual starvation.
Hence the fake news.
And I guess from just a protective, self-protection standpoint, Dr. Cooper, if you've been dieting or have been deprived of food for a long time, it would be really advantageous for the brain not to believe the leptin levels because it would want to store more fat because if you've been sort of depriving it of this energy, it would want more reserves just in case you continue to do that down the road in cases of famine. It would want more fat to survive, right?
Yes, that's the whole thing. And so the brain, through its pathway, then alters its signals back to the body that prevent your body from accessing those fat stores as an energy source and cause your body to compartmentalize more energy into the fat stores. And so even if your leptin levels are okay, this can still happen just if your ghrelin levels get too high, the hormone from the stomach, the ghrelin, because it turns out the ghrelin can alter the receptor at the brain that receives that leptin signal. So the ghrelin can interfere with the brain's ability to see the leptin. And so if it can't see it, that's something called leptin resistance. And if it cannot see it, it really can panic and cause the body fat to accumulate even faster, basically.
I feel like we need to create an animated feature, Andrea. What's that one that your great nephew
It
loves?
feels like caveman times. It feels like it's like protecting you against like caveman, like against dinosaurs taking your food or something.
But what's the name of that animated feature?
Oh, the Inside Out.
Yeah, Inside Out. That up in your brain, we've got all these competing voices.
Controlling
Yeah.
and like controlling everything for your food and like people stealing your food.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. It's not just
Even when it's fake. Even when it's fake, it's like it's a mask. It's like they're hiding the real truth.
Yeah, I mean, it only sees what it sees, and it acts on that. And
It's
so,
like it's hiding behind a fake screen.
And the good thing about it is the brain isn't just looking at one thing. It's looking at the whole array of input signals. And based on that, that's going to then determine the levels of some of these other hormones and neurotransmitters, neurochemicals that are in the brain that actually regulate the metabolism. And so those input signals, they begin at what's called the hypothalamus, which is like a very high center of the brain. And there are some famine signals there that their default position is to be elevated. So that's to protect us. So unless proven otherwise, they're going to be in an elevated state of alert. And it's going to be saying, you're in a famine unless you can prove you're not, basically.
Right,
And
but sometimes something is faking it out.
yeah. And how can you prove it? You have to have good incoming signals to prove, no, we're not in a famine. And then it's only when it receives that positive signaling coming back in that's very reassuring, which we call nutritional security signals.
Right.
Once those come in, that reduces the level of these famine signals in the brain that are very, very powerful weight gaining, promoting, and appetite increasing chemicals. And so if it gets that proper input, then those levels kind of calm down. And when they calm down, it actually allows the next step in the metabolic pathway to occur. So that next step produces some really powerful beneficial hormones, especially something called melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that one activates receptors throughout the brain that regulate our satiety, which means, your sense of satisfaction after you eat, and then also regulates our energy expenditure, like how our metabolic rate is, our body weight set point, and our insulin levels. And it does it through this whole feedback loop by sending that signal back to our body. And so, the problem is if, say, it's kind of like the game of telephone, I think. It's, if you have a group of signals that are very positive, but you have one that is saying it's negative, that could cause the brain to put the brakes on the metabolism and send an alert signal back to the body. So then those areas that were sending positive signals start to question that signal and start to question whether they should really feel secure enough to send the truth, or they should alter their truth to try to help the body conserve energy since they're receiving an alert. The beauty of a feedback loop is that if it's strong, it stays strong because the strength reinforces strength. And a person like that is a person that does not have metabolic dysfunction. And that is not really the majority of people anymore. But there are people that do not have metabolic dysfunction, and their feedback loop is strong and it stays strong. And the strength of it keeps it strong. But other people have glitches, and glitches promote more glitches. And so it weakens because it's a feedback loop. As it goes through that loop, it's weakening the next signals coming in, which are weakening the output signals from the brain. So that's why it's very difficult for people that are challenged by abnormal body weight problems and diabetes and insulin resistance and things like that to figure out how to get out of that situation without medication.
Right. I figure out I had a bunch of these negative Nellies in my system, and it took 40-something years and medication to figure out how to shut them up, And it's still happening to shut them up. Oy, oy, oy.
Well, I think what's also interesting is that I'm sure there are a ton of people listening to this podcast who, like you, Andrea, and like me, have metabolic dysfunction or syndrome. And Dr. Cooper, they've probably been told by their general doc they just need to exercise more and eat better. That's exactly what my doc told me.
Yeah, years and years.
And that just doesn't work. So, Dr. Cooper, can you talk to that person who struggled, maybe with their weight, maybe with their health for years, and have just been told by their family doctor it's their fault and they're just not doing enough to exercise and eat better? How do
everyone's
they,
glitches are different, too.
Yeah, different. So how do they get a handle on what their body's input signals are and what their brain is thinking and perceiving? Because if you just look at cholesterol, right, or blood pressure or these other factors, those are just an indication that something's wrong. But unless you look at these hormone levels, you won't understand why, right?
Right. I feel like it's important to look at the levels of these things and from lots of different angles, as many as you can, and then also whether or not you have evidence it's signaling correctly. Because the levels could be fine and the signals could be off, showing that it's not receiving those signals correctly. And so you want to look at all those relationships. But that's something that, a doctor does, but we can talk a little bit more about how to get better labs and things like that. But unfortunately, a lot of the advice over the years that's been given by the medical community has actually made people's problems worse. And I don't mean to say that to knock anyone because, I think people are giving this advice with good intentions, but the curriculum has been really lacking in school, not to make excuses, but it has been lacking, and it takes forever to get the science to practical, use by the medical profession. But unfortunately, a lot of the advice they have given has made the problem worse for people because the advice, what's considered a quote, healthy diet, is not what they portray. It's not what they're giving this advice of cutting out starches and going on calorie restriction and these very low calorie diets and exercise under fueled, when actually those things are going to create more negative signals going into the brain, the nutrition insecurity signals coming up, and the brain freaking out more and raising those famine signals more and blocking the metabolism more ultimately. So it's just adding to the problem, not correcting the problem. And so that has been unfortunate. But I think we also don't want to minimize the importance of, really good nutrition and physical activity because they're important components of our health. But they just do not have the power to reverse these glitches and the metabolic dysfunction. They don't, unfortunately, for most cases. I mean, I know in my practice, I have patients coming in that have already tried everything. So maybe I'm skewed, my perspective, but I just don't see those things. And there's not in the literature long-term studies showing that those things long-term reverse metabolic dysfunction. They're very good for our health, and they may improve some aspects of our metabolism if we eat really well, like we always talk about, avoid chemical additives, all the food groups, complex carbs, everything that's beneficial. And if we're physically active, it's good for our health. And so it may improve certain aspects of our metabolism, but to reverse some of these powerful glitches that people have, it isn't going to be able to have that type of power.
So when I first came to you, Dr. Cooper, I had a pretty stubborn case of what you called insulin resistance. How did that short circuit my feedback loop?
Well, that's a good point. Now, so that's an area, insulin resistance not only sends negative signals up to the brain because of the really high insulin levels, but even in the periphery, it causes damage too, because the insulin resistance reflects the muscle tissue resistance to insulin, to the hormone insulin. So the muscle tissue can't take up fuel that it may need from the bloodstream. And so then the glucose, I think initially you had prediabetes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then the glucose builds up in the bloodstream, leading to this prediabetes. And so the elevation of the glucose in an abnormally high range and the insulin in an abnormally high range then sends signals to the brain also that trigger dysfunction of that whole pathway as well. Not to mention, can lead to fatty liver and other problems in the periphery. But how did you get to the insulin resistance in the first place? So that is not the original problem. There was something else that led to that insulin resistance. That was the initial glitch, we should say, the primary glitch. So it's important to look for what was the primary problem that we think is there and try to isolate that and make sure that treating that is a component of the overall treatment, not just treating secondary problems or these follow-on problems that occur. Because of this feedback loop, one thing goes wrong. And as we said, because it's a feedback loop, it's like a domino effect and starts to create other problems along that loop. And then on top of all of that, you have people who, to try to manage it, they've gone on diets. Now the diets have created a superimposed dysfunction on top of whatever the original dysfunction was. I have this term that I used to use a lot. It's called diet fog. And the reason I had that was because Once the diet impact on the metabolism is there, it becomes very difficult to see what the original problem was. It's almost as if it's superimposed and has taken over the dysfunction that you're seeing when you do lab work and things like that. But once you restore that problem and you get the brain to realize, okay, we're not starving, we're eating now, we're not on a diet, we're not under fueling exercise, then you start to see emerging what these original glitches might have been. And unless they're at the forefront, they're not really very effective to treat either. They're hard to treat.
I'd love to hear from you, Andrea, right now, because I think, Dr. Cooper, you talked about mindset and the goal of making the brain feel secure and that it's not in scarcity. Andrea, you've really gone through a transition and a transformation in terms of how you perceive food, how you perceive carbs, that food isn't bad, that it's something that should be celebrated and not fretted over, right?
I think that, look, my life has always centered around food, but the attitude that you have about food changes once you learn that it's not the enemy. And you can always, I've always celebrated food in a certain way, but now there's no guilt. And that's because I don't think every 5 seconds, oh my God, if I eat that, I'm going to be fat. If I eat that, I'm going to gain weight. If I eat that, it's going to mean that my life is over. I now can be like, I can have whatever I want and I eat as much as I want because I'm not going to eat a ton of it, which I never was an overeater. I have to state that I never was an overeater, but I always was worried about what it was going to do to my body, what was going to happen to me, what was the consequence of food. And now I don't see food as something that has a consequence. I see food as something that's joyous, that's wonderful, as something that's a part of my life in a great way, not as something that is harmful. And while it might not sound like a big deal, as somebody who food has really been a major part of their lives, it is a huge, huge change, and a huge change in attitude, a huge change in perspective. And it's just an amazing thing. And to find out that what was the curse of your entire life, really, like where you're like, oh my God, I'm fat, everybody's skinny. Oh my God, I look terrible. Oh my God, I wish I could wear that, but I can't because I'm fat and that's only made for skinny people. It's just like a total mind change in every single way, every minute of the day.
Yeah, it's what's interesting about what you just said, Andrea, it's that change in the mindset that just having that change also improved your metabolism.
Yeah. It lightened everything up.
Yeah, because the studies have shown that it's not only those chemical signals coming in from our body, but in our brain, the limbic system, which is like more of the emotional memory and things like that. If there's problems with body image dissatisfaction or what's called eating restraint, like so when you're eating feeling concerned or worried about that or thinking about that you shouldn't be eating it or any of that type of thing, or just this dissatisfaction with your body image, those signals impair our metabolic feedback loop also and act as alarms in our feedback loop, because it's not just the emotional side, but it's also looking at what our intention is. So our brain has to interpret the incoming signals, but it also has to interpret what our intention is around food, exercise, and our emotional state about our body image and this eating restraint emotions, because all of that will determine how safe it is for the brain to put that green light on our metabolic pathway and allow it to burn the fuel, or whether it really should be, even though the input signals look okay, you're freaking out about eating this food. It can't rely on you that you're going to eat that food. And you're at the time you're eating, you're thinking about you should exercise, which is like really not good.
Right.
Because it's sending a really negative signal. And so that alone could alter what the brain was planning on telling the body about things based on just those objective indicators coming in. So it is thinking about that. It's even looking at what your plans are for energy expenditure. It knows if you're going to go run a big race that day because it's part of your brain and your thoughts. And so All of this is being shown to be part of what regulates our metabolism. And so in a person with a glitch, everything becomes accentuated. Those glitches, they cause an insecurity or hesitation, paranoia, you could say, for the brain to lower those negative signals, those famine signals. They're called agouti-related peptide, neuropeptide Y, galanin. There's a bunch of them. And those chemicals are really good at putting the brakes on our metabolism, jacking up our appetite, and increasing our weight set point if there's not enough security in that whole entire feedback loop, including your thoughts and emotions.
I mean, but believe me, I'm not putting on a bikini tomorrow. There's a lot of fat I could fold up and, throw over my shoulder. But, that's not happening. And I'm not running a big race. I'm not doing that. But I do feel happier knowing that it wasn't my fault. Things happened. My genetics pointed to it. I'm doing the best I can. That confidence changed a lot of things, and it sort of spilled over into other things. It really did. And I just feel good about it. So I'm doing the best I can.
And I feel like, Dr. Cooper, a big part of what you teach us, your patients, is just a global perspective on what your body and what your metabolism needs. So people who are underfueling or not fueling their exercise, that's bad. They're not fueling afterward. That's bad. They're dieting to fit into that dress or to fit into that suit for the special occasion. That can cause lifelong damage. And the more that we understand that just how sensitive our body is to mistreatment when it comes to proper fueling and proper mindset, I think it's just really transformative how you've gotten us to understand what the global perspective is on all this stuff and what we can control, like a good night's sleep. How many Americans are shorting their sleep every night?
And how important that is.
It's a massive epidemic. And you've told us that certain key hormones are only produced during that full night's sleep.
Yes.
So controlling what we can goes a long way to treating all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like that might be a good place to just put a stamp on this. We started out with a pretty salacious beginning.
Right.
Fake news.
Yeah. But your metabolism is about so much more than like your pant size or your dress size or whatever. It really has to do with your whole body, your whole mental. It's your brain as well as your body, and I didn't know that before I started working with Dr. Cooper, and it's fascinating to me, just so fascinating.
Super intricate what our brain does to regulate all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Well, this has been such a fun conversation. Thanks to you two for another episode of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.